Welcome to Know Before You Go for the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time. My name is Father Brendan Curran, Dominican promoter for justice and peace. What a rich mixture of readings we have on this Sunday. And there seems to be a line throughout each of these readings that we can lift up this week. And it speaks to the heart of what is faith. Not just what is faith, but how do we lean on our faith as people baptized in our journey of faith. We hear that in the first reading from the book of Wisdom that lifts up and highlights to those who follow the story of never forgetting the story of Passover, of the Passover experience of the early Jews, of recognizing that God fulfilled the promises in the midst of peril and persecution of an oppressed people of the Israelites. In the second reading, the book, the Hebrews, we hear a whole litany of different reminders and examples going back generations of different figures, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and so many others, of how they were people who also, despite all the doubts and uncertainties, leaned on their faith, even realizing that at the end of their life journey, they may not see it physically fulfilled, but believed. And then in the gospel story, the continuing excerpt of the Gospel of Luke, right after last Sunday, where we hear about this great rich man who had this abundant harvest, and instead of pondering about a wonderful and plentiful harvest, could only focus on his equipment, his materials, and how he could hold a household of more and more silos for the grains of that harvest for himself. Faith. The rich man could not recognize nor lean on faith. So let us go back and dive in deep on this experience of this challenge for each of us of faith. How do we see what we see in the world? In a world today with all of its struggles, doubts, and uncertainties, the war in Ukraine, the struggles across the world, the threats of Taiwan, the struggles of a pandemic across the world with numbers creeping back up again, and another strange new illness that might be another new threat, just to name a few, not to mention your own neighborhood or homes yourselves. Yes, it is a perplexing world that gives us sometimes grave and deepening doubts, if we're truly honest. But how do we lean on our faith? The second reading begins with this powerful phrase, but also full of the uncertainties of what faith is. Faith is the realization of what is hoped for, and yet of evidence of things not seen. Not seen. The constant faith struggle for each of us to continue to believe in faith. It gives us ponder, it gives us pause. This Sunday, we have a collection of readings that invite us and lift up all of these ways to deal with this prudent but utterly essential and fundamental question for each of us. Where is our faith in these days? Do we lean on our faith and choose a way that we can recognize a promise of a hope of the reign of God in the future that clearly and utterly is not realized in the perils in our midst in these days? Or do we choose to give up on faith at all? Faith or no faith? The first reading from the book of Wisdom, we are reminded in that passage of never forgetting the story of the Passover. Israelites in peril, in persecution, in slavery in Egypt could possibly see a way out and trust it and lean on it. In the second reading, the story of the book of Hebrews, a constant reminder through various symbols and people of powerful faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed even when he was called out to a foreign place, even when he and Sarah lived in the midst of tents for years. Leaning on faith, Abraham believed that there must be a promise realized in sensing a trust in God's promise for him. In leaning on faith, he also bore in his old age, he and Sarah bore in their old age a son. Leaning on faith, God providing for them. Let us not forget Jacob on his deathbed. In his very last breaths, chose to bless all of the sons of Joseph. Leaning on faith. Leaning on faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months from the death threats of the Pharaoh. Where did their hope come from? Where did their values come from to choose to hide this sacred child? Leaning on faith and showing resistance. Moses and Aaron left the Pharaoh's harm, left the slavery of Egypt, guiding the Israelites even through a sea, even looking back and seeing all the soldiers about to destroy them, leaning on faith. In the gospel story, Jesus said to the disciples, "Do not be afraid any longer, O little flock." In other words, you may be weak. You may not recognize or feel the strength of your faith, but God, who is pleased with you, will give you the kingdom one day if you lean on faith. The gospel really sets us up to remind each of us that this is not just a challenge for all of our ancestors that we lift up in these scripture examples, but they're a call to each of us, preacher, listener, and faithful parishioner, too. How do you lean on faith? Do you recognize the promise of the reign of God is becoming in our world one day? Recognizing that each of us are blessed to be instruments of that sacred journey of faith? Leaning on faith like Abraham and Sarah, leaning on faith like Isaac, leaning on faith like Jacob, leaning on faith like all of these different reminders and ancestors, proudly leaning on the faith of the abundance of God. So this day and this week, let us choose to lean a little bit on the bedrock of our faith in God.